Hi, everybody. We are both really happy to be here. So we wanted to do, because, everybody's in lockdown right now and haven't been able to get very far away. So we thought we would present this sort of introduction to bryology from the perspective of some of the more common species of mosses and liverworts that you would see just as close as your backyard, heck, as close as the sidewalk in front of your house or even your balcony. So we were keeping it really close to home and some of the really common things so that you can don't have to go very far to be able to see something cool and to be able to recognize maybe something that you've seen in this presentation. And we're both really excited to tell anybody about moss, so we're happy to be here. So my name is Cassandra, and I am the technician at the Canadian Museum of Nature. And my email and my Twitter and my iNaturalist credentials are here. So you can contact me about your burning moss questions. So I'm a technician at the Museum of Nature working right now on the vascular plant herbarium reorganization project, but I am also very keen on looking at and telling people about bryophytes. And I've been doing that for almost 10 years now, off and on. So I'm excited. So over to Jennifer.
Here are my coordinates. I also enjoy getting moss questions. I work at the herbarium with Cassandra over at the Museum of Nature in Gatineau. There's the herbarium there. I hope that many of you have had a chance to visit and that everybody else will come on over when we're allowed to visit again. But it's a big room full of carefully preserved flattened plants, just a library where people can come and find answers to their botanical questions and also find people who have similar botanical interests. And it has a great collection of mosses as well. So this is a terrific resource for Cassandra and I and for many other herbarium users across the country and around the world. This is sort of the game plan that we made for today. Cassie will talk about the difference between moss and lichen and maybe some other botanical entities out there, just so that we all know that what we're talking about. I have a few sort of set up facts about mosses so that we're all on the same page. And then we've picked out a baker's dozen, a fairly generous baker's dozen of national capital mosses that are living very close to all of us, no matter where we travel or live in the city. So that while we're waiting for the stay-at-home orders to end, we can go and learn some species. I'm also going to mention a couple of the really interesting rarer species that are right in town here. And we'd like to close with some of the tools and resources you can use if you're getting started in this adventure of mosses. We do have some practice questions at the end, and if you have questions, as Cassandra said, we're so happy to answer them. Back to Cassie.
Okay, so throughout this presentation, we're going to be using words like bryophyte and bryology, just so we're all on the same page. So bryology is the study of bryophytes, and bryophytes are mosses. Bryophytes is the term that incorporates mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. So bryon is Latin for moss, or bryon Greek for luxuriant growth, which I think is very fitting. And so we're going to be mostly talking about mosses, and we may just say mosses throughout this presentation, but often we're referring to bryophytes in general. We will mostly be talking about mosses, but we'll also cover some liverworts. Hornworts, not so much, because there aren't that many species here, and they're very hard to find. So First of all, what are we talking about when we're talking about mosses or liverworts, bryophytes? What are they as opposed to other things? And so here I'll show you some mosses, for example. So these are mosses. You can see they have, in general, so general statement, mosses are very simple plants, but they are plants. They're terrestrial plants. They're just very simply designed terrestrial plants. They still have a stem and branches and leaves. Well, some of them have branches. The leaves are just very, very small. You can, and sometimes they're very hard to see the individual leaves, but in cases like the middle right, you can see that the stem and the leaves are quite distinct. The leaves are very large, so they're a bit easier to see. Whereas in some cases, the leaves may just give it that overall shaggy texture, and they're hard to see individually. And then we have the liverworts, I think is the next slide. And so these can be leafy or thalloid. So on the right, you see leafy liverworts, and on the left is a thalloid liverwort. So those are two pretty separate entities, but they're similar to mosses in that they're both terrestrial land. They're both land plants that are very simple in design. They both photosynthesize like mosses, and they're just both very small and grow low to the ground. And so that we can compare bryophytes, so mosses and liverworts, to something that they're often confused with. Often when I talk about mosses or lichens, because I have a tendency to talk excitedly about both of them, if I talk about one, people tend to ask me ask me questions that suggest that they're thinking of lichens, for example, if I'm talking about mosses, or vice versa, or ask me, wait, so there's this thing called moss that you're talking about, but there's also this thing called lichens. So what's the difference? So that's actually the most common question I get when I'm telling people about these things for the first time. So these are lichens. They, in general, I would say overall, you can see there's differences in color. So mosses and liverworts are green, pretty much consistently green, whereas lichens, especially when they're dry, they may be different, some shade of green, but they're usually a mint green or a yellow, a very light yellow green. You can get them very green when they are very wet, but for the most part, when they are dry, they are much more pastel in color or very dark in color, like black or brown. And they tend to be very opaque and very matte colored. And so lichens are symbiosis of an algae and a fungus. So they're they're a fungi algal sandwich, whereas bryophytes are simple plants. And so in general, you can look at a moss, for example, and you can compare it to a lichen. And when you're looking at the two together, they're pretty different. It's when you're looking at a set of mosses and a set of lichens, it's pretty easy to get a sense that they're two different things. But so you can see here that, yeah, they're fairly different. You can see the individual leaves on the moss, whereas the lichen will never have anything that looks like leaves even if you look really close up. But having said that, there are some cases, there's some exceptions to that. There are some cases where you might get confused. So for example, I was talking about thalloid liverworts. They can look very similar to a very, very wet, very happy, some kinds of very wet, very happy lichens. So here we have Marcantia, which is a thalloid liverwort on the left, and Peltidra, which is a lichen on the right. But the Peltidra, when it's very wet, and it likes to live in a lot of the same kinds of forest floor habitats that some liverworts can live in, so it can be confusing. So just all that to say, there are general rules and then there are exceptions to those rules. There are things designed to trip you up. And so next slide. Come on. It may be very delayed for me. Okay, there we go. So mosses can also look like very tiny plants. One example is so there are some flowering plants, for example, that are very, very small. And sometimes those can be confused for mosses. So you have, for example, here a rhizonium, which is a moss on the left, and it has very large leaves for a moss, but they're very delicate leaves, and there are no obvious flower structures. And then you'll see this chrysosplenium on the right. And this is the leaves are very opaque. You can't see through them. They're very they're small, but they're hardy. And they look like they have some real thickness to them. And you can see when you look up closely, you can see the flowering structures. You can see the anthers on the flowers. And another example of a moss looking like a small plant, or a moss being confused with a small plant, is things where they might use the same name, use the word moss in the description. So for example, club moss. In the next slide, it is a vascular plant, so it is a more complex plant than a moss. It is not itself a moss. It's called moss. Club moss is called moss, but it isn't actually a moss. And so those are the sorts of things that can get confusing sometimes. Moss used to be a term that was used very cavalier in history, and so there are some things that are called moss that are not actually moss. Same with some algae that are called moss when they're not actually a moss. Yeah. So here's a sort of a picture to get your juices flowing about thinking about the differences between those things. So this branch has a moss and a lichen on it, and you can sort of start thinking to yourself whether you can see the difference, see which one is a lichen and which one's a moss. And if you can, you're off to a great start. And the same with the next photo. There's at least one moss and two lichens and at least one vascular plant in this photo. And so if you can see the differences from the get-go, then we're off and running.
Okay, my turn. As I mentioned at the start, we are going to introduce some really common and abundant species that are growing close to home, but I'd like to take a few minutes to set some of that up. And the first point I'd like to mention is that mosses are plants and similar to larger plants in lots of ways, but you have to look at them at the right scale. By which I mean that telling two oak species apart means looking at the shape of the leaf, looking at how pointy the lobes are, or how long the petiole is, or maybe how the venation goes. And looking at mosses, you compare the same kinds of things. You can look at the shape of the leaves, or the teeth at the margin of the leaves, or the length of the mid vein, but you have to look very, very close up. You need at least a magnifying glass, and that's the kind of view that you get here on the right. And if you happen to have a microscope, then you can get even closer and see some of these even more detailed features. And if you have a microscope, then you can go even further, and different species will have different shapes of cells. These would be just a few microns wide. Luckily, though, it's possible to see plenty with just a handheld hand lens. And that's the level of detail that we plan to focus on in the presentation today. You can't necessarily get to species without a microscope, but you can definitely separate different groups, and you can see a lot of beautiful things. We'll be showing some pictures, well, many pictures in this presentation. And just to orient you a bit, we'll be showing habitats, and we'll be showing colonies like this one here of mosses. And then we'll also be zooming right in on individual plants or groups of plants like this one that's been taken from the colony and then enlarged even more. Next, I also wanted to make sure that everybody knows the main parts of a moss. Down here, there are some leaves and a stem, similar to what you would see on any other plant, but very, very small, of course. And then sometimes, depending on the stage of the plant's life cycle that you happen to be observing, there may be a stalk called a seta. and at the top of the stalk, a capsule that is full of spores. The capsule can take all kinds of cool forms and colors and shapes. It can have different ways of dispersing the spores depending on the different kinds of mosses. Here's an example that actually has a kind of drum head across the end of the capsule with holes around the perimeter where spores can kind of shake out like a salt shaker. So mosses have capsules, and that's how they disperse. They never have flowers. Sometimes when you look at a moss with your hand lens, you might see a little flower-like structure, like these ones here with the brown centers and then a ring of leaves around the outside that look a little bit like petals. Those are actually male moss plants. I have another example here. This one's not quite mature, so you don't see the brown center, it's still green, but you can still see that very flower-like shape. So unlike many other plants, mosses do not have seeds or flowers. They do have spores, but spores are not the only way that mosses disperse. They're what's called totipotent. I love this word. This is probably a high score in Scrabble. It means that any cell can divide and differentiate into a fully functional new individual plant, kind of like the brooms in the Sorcerer's Apprentice when he tries to whack it apart with an axe and every single fragment of the broom grows into another broom and carries more water. That's mosses. So if we step on them or drive across them, then it's very easy for pieces to break off and we can transport them from one place to the next. Some species have taken extra advantage of this feature by having very brittle parts that fall off very easily when a bird or a chipmunk brushes across it. And that's a very important way in which the plants are dispersed within a local habitat. Some studies have shown by brushing the fur of chipmunks that they're covered with these little fragments of mosses, these little vegetative propagules. Mosses disperse or fragment, I should say, very easily when they're dry. And here's a good example of a very dry moss that's baking on the Alvar pavement in the hot sun. So ripe for breaking off and blowing in the wind. But also it's capable of just reversing what looks like complete death here. As soon as there's some rain or some flood water, it will revive and open up because it can repair itself so quickly. It means that when you're getting to know mosses, you need to know what it looks like when it's dry and when it's wet. In this picture, the plants on the right are the same species as the ones on the left. They're both this hairy, twisted moss, but they look very different in these two different states. Similarly with this one, the plants on the top are hydrated and the ones down below are dry. So for every species that you learn, you kind of need to learn it twice, once in the rain and once on a sunny, dry day. And that's it for the setup. Next, we're going to introduce you to some species, and I'll hand it back to Cassandra to talk about plants that are probably growing on your lawn or a lawn near you.
Right. Yeah. So the first of our suite of mosses near you is things that tend to grow on lawns. We're going to introduce not just species, but sometimes we may be introducing groups of species. The reason for that is because a lot of the time with bryophytes, the species, differentiating it to species can really requires a microscope in a lot of cases. And so when it comes to getting more comfortable with groups in the field, it's a lot easier to become confident with genera, so the genus at the genus level rather than the species level. So just keep that in mind, that sometimes we're talking about groups of species more at the genus level. And so the first example of exactly that is this fern moss, which is in the genus Thuidium. There are two very common species around here, but differentiating them really reliably actually requires a compound microscope, looking at individual cells of the little mini leaves that are on the stem. So this one gets its name fern moss because it is very pinnate. It has these very regular branches, and very tidy regular branches all along the length of the stem that give it a very lace-like appearance. And so next you can see it kind of hiding in a lawn. The colonies tend to form themselves up in the shelter of grass and other plants. So here's an example of seeing it sort of from head person eye view, looking down, and then the insert, you can see it closer up. And so that's an enlarged view that you can see it where it's showing off that lace-like texture, and then zoomed in even more, you can see it really nicely, the individual branches and the leaves. So you can see there the very, very regular branching pattern. It's also other things that make it sort of distinct is it has a very matte appearance. You might hear us talk about that a lot, is that sometimes shiny versus not shiny, shiny versus dull can be a very useful character for identifying groups of species in the field. So this one is very, looks dull. It doesn't have a glossy appearance to it. And another thing to keep in mind about this group is that they tend to look the same whether they're wet or dry. So in the next slide, you can see they tend to be very similar compared to whether, like, if they're wet or dry. So I know Jennifer was just talking about how so many of them look so different when they're wet versus dry, but in this case, it's actually it doesn't mess you up as much because they tend to stay the same, which is nice. The next group of species looks very different when it's wet versus dry. These are the thyme mosses, the genus Plagionaeum. These ones are very, very common on lawns, especially. In fact, the next slide is a photo I just took yesterday on a lawn next to the bus stop near my house. And the neon green that you can see in the grass is all Plagionaeum. So all the neon green that you can see in that lawn is the Plagionaeum. And then to the right, you can see a close-up shot of what that neon green actually is. So this group of species tends to, I find the leaves tend to look like kind of like rosebush leaves. They're very, very broad leaves with a very obvious midrib down the middle. The next slide shows the capsules. So the insert here, you can see the immature capsules, and in the bigger slide, you can see the mature capsules, and you can even see on one of the capsules the individual teeth at the opening, and so that's the sort of gateway that the spores come out of. And so on a lot of species, the teeth are actually very characteristic. In this case, not so much, but I just wanted to show that because it's a very good photo in that case. Capsules are very common in this group, and that's something that can differ between groups of species. Sometimes it's very rare to see capsules on a given genus or species, whereas in this genus, it's very, very common. And there are these nice nodding capsules. So the capsule itself is drooping down and it is hanging from a stalk that has a bend in it. And so another thing that is characteristic of some species in this group is these sort of what we call plagiotropic shoots, which are just basically runners. So shoots that'll grow, instead of being upright, will creep along the the ground. And so if you see that kind of appearance with these really nice broad leaves, that's a good indication that you're looking at a Plagionaeum. And finally, if you do want to look at other, try and differentiate this group to species, one of the important characters to keep in mind is the margin at the edge of the leaf, because the margin at the edge of the leaf often has teeth, these little points along the margin, and then the size, presence, size, and distribution of the teeth can help you separate between species. So if you are getting interested and want to try to do that, that is one important character to look at. The next group of species that I want to cover is the Catherine mosses, or Atricum, the genus Atricum. I really like this one. It tends to grow more in shady lawns. What you notice right away that's distinct about it is it has these really long leaves and these thick, dark ridges along the middle of the leaf. And that's actually like a ridge of raised cells that runs in ribbons along the top of the leaf. And then the other character you can see is that the leaves are actually very wavy, they're undulate. And so if you see a long leaf like that with a thick band down the middle and then the waves along the length of the leaf, that's a good sort of mind's eye character that you're looking at, the Atricum, the genus Atricum, or the Catherine mosses. This group tends to grow in, like I said, it tends to grow in shadier lawns, or you can also find it's very common on the forest floor, especially on exposed dirt or sort of hard packed mud. I see it a lot on the bike path near my house. So the edge of the margin of the bike path where the leaves tend to get blown off by leaf blowers or whatnot. And so there's you can see a nice thick patch of Atricum in those areas. And the picture on the right shows the capsules. So you can see how those capsules differ from the Plagionaeum that I had shown earlier. The capsules aren't hanging from a bent stalk, but rather the capsule itself is slightly bent, and it's coming sort of straight out from a straight stalk. And so this group also looks very different when it's wet versus dry. You can see the wet plants, the leaves are straight out and open like the pictures I was showing earlier, but you can see the dry looks very, very different. It's brown, the leaves are curled inward very tightly, so you wouldn't be able to recognize those characters that we were talking about if you saw it dry. And so, but if it were to rain on this moss, the whole colony would look like the wet plant. So it's just got a very distinct difference, but those shoots aren't dead, they're just dry and they're just waiting for water. The last species that I'm going to go over for lawns is Lindbergh's Hypnum limburgii. So it's in the genus Hypnum, and those mosses, you can tell them by the hook-shaped, sort of sickle-shaped leaves that are all pointing in the same direction along the shoot. So in this case, a lot of the shoots are standing upright, but if the shoot were to creep along the ground, you would see all the leaves are curved so that they're pointing toward the ground or toward the belly of the shoot, sort of thing. This species can be very shaggy and very have sort of a poofy appearance. And here it is growing along the side of a road. So it tends to grow on lawns that are a bit less shady, more exposed to sunlight. So you can see an example here of it from far away and then zoomed in. And so that's it actually for lawn species. And so over to Jennifer again for the things you can find on your sidewalk.
So yeah, these are the most extreme of city environments: the pavement, the gravel, the very disturbed dry soil. And because these next four species are so good at handling stress and dispersing themselves, you'll see them not only in most cities, but also in other extreme environments like the tops of mountains and in the Arctic. So if you see some very non-Ottawa plants in the background of some of the next pictures, it's because they grow on sidewalks, but then also on windswept tundra deserts. First up here is the silvery bryum, which gets its name from the silvery sheen that it has when it's damp, but also the whitish cast that it has when it's dry. You don't see its capsules nearly as often as you see the little silvery plants, but they're really fun to find. You can see that they nod down sort of like a lantern from a bent stalk. These stalks are only about 1 centimeter tall at most. It's very, very good at breaking off and dispersing. And in fact, it produces some little plantlets, you know, like a mother of thousands plant, sort of pre-packaged mini plants that break off very easily and get stuck in the feet of animals and so on, and will disperse and grow into new plants elsewhere. This is the sidewalk between Carleton University and the Rideau River. And here's the silvery bryum in the grooves between the stones and the pavement. Probably a bit sheltered from foot traffic, and it might get a little bit more moisture there as well. And then similarly, this is just on the road next to Raven Park in Carleton, right in the exact same kind of microhabitat, showing why you should never leave home without your hand lens. But one place to see really nice silvery bryum is along the canal. This is above Hartwell Locks, so Hartwell Lock is off in the distance here. And there's a lot of mosses along the edge of the canal. If you just take note of this stick or match or whatever it is, here it is again. And here's the silvery bryum interspersed with another species of moss right along the edge of the canal. This is silvery bryum too, and it's with another moss, which is called fire moss. And there's a beautiful patch of it on a parking island behind Westgate Mall. This is where this is taken. The plants of fire moss don't look that interesting. I mean, it's just sort of a generic cushion of fuzzy moss, but what you notice right away is all of the capsules. It's very prolific in producing capsules, especially at this time of year. You might see them in different stages of development. So in March, approximately, you'll see them just with stalks and the capsules have not yet formed. Then in April, you have capsules, but they're still green. They're not yet mature. And eventually they will turn a kind of wine red or rust red color and develop ridges on them, as well as a little kind of Adam's apple swelling right at the neck, right between the capsule and where it meets the stalk. So that's fun hand lens practice, looking at the capsules and trying to find this little diagnostic bump at the neck. Here we are walking down Maryvale, and again, there's tons of fire moss everywhere. It likes disturbed habitats, really. So it's on lots of city streets. It's also something that becomes very abundant after forest fires, or you might even find it in an old fire pit. It doesn't take a lot of space, so it can occupy any small area that has the kind of rotten conditions that it likes. In the same parking island, there's another species. So here's the fire moss with its kind of red capsules. But here on the right is another one, also very prolifically fruiting, and that's called the bonfire moss. That one has, as you can see or start to see here, it has curly stalks on the capsules, whereas the examples that we've seen so far, they've been straight up. These ones are kind of curled and gnarled around. The plants have leaves that are all tight together and form a kind of a teardrop shape that's very similar in size and shape to the kind of pear-shaped capsules. And then as it matures, it will get a a red ring around the mouth where eventually the spores will be dispersed. So really the main feature to look for is these curly stalks. Here it is between patio stones. And lastly, in this segment, I just wanted to mention the hairy twisted moss again. This is the one that we were talking about earlier that changes a lot when it's wet or dry. It has leaves that curl back, a bit like the leaves at the top of a pineapple. And every single leaf has a long white hair point coming from it. This is the same colony, dry, and after a little bit of water has been sprinkled on it, this change happens very quickly. Like if you don't have your hand lens ready, you might miss it. It's a fun thing to do if you're out picnicking on dry limestone rocks. And since we're talking about plants that have white hair points and grow in disturbed places, I'll also just mention this bristly haircap moss. It also has white hair points. It also changes when it's wet, but it takes a long time to change. If you sprinkle water on this, you can go away and eat your lunch and come back and you still won't miss it. You can see that the leaves are not curled back the way a pineapple does. They're more straight or curled in. There they are side by side. There's the hairy twisted moss and here's the bristly hair cap. And here they are when they're dry. The hairy twisted moss is very curly and twisted, as the name would suggest. And the bristly hair cap is that keeps its leaves straight when it folds up. And now the most convenient of all moss substrates.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about groups of species that you can find mostly on the barks of trees sort of at knee height or higher. I say that only because a lot more things grow on the base of trees, because a lot of the stuff that grows on forest floor can grow up the base of a tree. And so you can find a lot more things lower down, but I'm going to talk about things that you can usually find a lot higher up. One example is maybe not the most common and not maybe the most likely to see on a city street, for example, but it's very lush and very fun. So I'll talk about it first. So it's called poodle moss, or genus Anomodon. And it's, you can sort of see where it gets the name poodle moss. When it's dry-ish, as long as it's not very wet, it has this so each of the individual branches has this tightly curled sort of has a club-like curl to it, and it can be very, very thick and dense, sort of like the curl on a poodle's coat. So this is one of those ones that looks very different when it's dry versus wet. And this is actually one of the examples that Jennifer had shared earlier. So you can see the shoots are very curled and the individual leaves are tightly oppressed to the shoot when it's dry, but when it's wet, when it's completely wet, the leaves flatten out in like completely flat in one plane, and branching out, spreading out from the central axis of the stem, and the shoots themselves straighten out too. So it has this it forms this lush kind of skirt on trees. If you are trying to see if you can identify one of these species, one of the species is a lot more common than others, and that is Anomodon attenuatus. It has many branches. As you can see in this lower right photo is a shoot of attenuatus, and so the branches are a lot more common. So it has a lot more branches coming off of a shoot, and it has this tapering, it tapers very gradually to a very narrow point, whereas other species of Anomodon don't do that. They tend to be coming out from the tree as one single shoot, and they don't have that same really abrupt narrow attenuate sort of tapered look. And so the next group that I'm going to talk about, next group of species is the stalking mosses, or Pylaisia. So this one also can look quite curly, but in a very different way. You can sort of see the texture is very, very different, even though they're both very curly. So in this case, the reason it looks curly is because the individual shoots are all, the leaves themselves are fairly straight, but the shoots themselves are curled down, out, and then up, and then back towards the bark of the tree. And so that's a picture of it farther away and close up. This one is fairly common. This one's very common to see, especially higher up on a tree. Chances are pretty good if you see something that looks quite bushy, relatively high on a tree, and it's forming, it looks like it might be forming mats. It's probably this. And so you can see the curls. It's also, the texture again is important here. You can see Pylaisia, the stalking mosses are very shiny. They have that silky curl. I feel like it could be in like a hair product ad, you know, it gives you silky, shiny curls, the perfect little silky, shiny curls. And so you can see examples of the curls magnified here on the top right. And you can see, so those branches are quite small, but they're all very, very tightly curled. And then on the bottom right, you can see examples of the capsules, which are fairly straight, and the capsule itself is a little bit elongated. Compare that with another species that you tend to find at, you know, head height on a tree that is small, kind of small like Pylaisia is, but this one is a fair bit smaller. It's called Leschia. There again, it's a group of species. There are a few species like this, but unlike Pylaisia, you can see, or unlike the stalking mosses, you can see that it's not curly. It's very dull colored, or very dull. It doesn't have that same shiny, silky look to it. And the individual branches or shoots are very long and just string down, like they hang down sort of limp and stringy. I used to, when I was doing my honors project, before I knew what this was and I needed to identify it in the lab, I just called it stringy moss. So that can be a good cue. The next group of species is actually a whole family, because identifying it to genus can sometimes be tricky too. And this is the bristle mosses, or the family Orthotrichaceae. And the bristle mosses, you tend to see them, they're very different. So far I've been showing things that tend to form very big mats on trees, and these usually will tend to form very little distinct cushions of many individual plants coming out from the bark of a tree. It's very dark, dull colored leaves. The leaves are spreading when wet. But if you want to try narrowing it down to different groups within that family, one of the characters is to look at the leaves when they're dry. So some species within this group have straight leaves that are just tightly pressed to the shoot when it's dry, and the leaves curl very tightly when it's dry. And then another character that you can look at if you're interested in narrowing these things down, that also shows a little bit of the diversity between the species in this family, is the capsules. The capsules the extent to which the capsule comes out of the shoot of the plant can be an important thing to look at. So in some cases, the capsule is very nestled very close into the end of the shoot, end of every individual little plant. In some cases, it may just be starting to come out of the shoot. And in some cases, the capsule may actually emerge very far out of the shoot and have a very visible like stalk that you can see. And so that's an important character sometimes. Another species this time. So this one, finally, we can get to a species that grows on trees, and it's not too bad. If you see this, chances are pretty good that you can get it to species. So this is Shingle Moss, or Neckera pennata. I just have the one slide for it because I find it notoriously difficult to photograph. I'm not sure why. There's something about the texture. I think they always come out blurry, or if maybe it's just the fact that I always see them on cloudy days when it's really dark, maybe. Anyway, so you can see that the plants are coming straight out, very flat from the tree. The shoots themselves are in completely flat plane with the leaves coming out on either side. And you can see the leaves. What's interesting about the leaves on this one is it has this very undulate, wavy appearance, kind of like the Catherine moss that we were looking at on lawns. And it gives it this kind of crepe paper texture that's really, really distinct. So when you're looking at something that's skirting out from a tree and it's got this really crepe paper fringed look to it, that's probably a shingle moss. And the other cool thing about it is the capsules actually are sunken in underneath the shoots. So there's, in the red circle, you can actually see some capsules, actually a very densely packed group of capsules nestled in underneath the shoot. So those ones are actually pretty cool. I saw a question, shingles because of how its growth looks or because it often grows on shingles? I'm not 100% sure, maybe Jennifer can clarify this, but I'm guessing because of the texture.
Yeah, if it grows on shingles,
it is sort of coming out like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if it grows on shingles, it's not in our area at all. It would have to be a very
yeah, it would have to be it'd have to be in a rainforest probably to get it growing on shingles. Okay, so that's shingle moss, and then so now I'm gonna show just two species of actual liverworts. There are two species of leafy liverwort that grow on trees that can be quite distinct, and so can be fun to try and recognize in the field. So I thought I'd go over those. The first is wall scalewort. And so this one, you can see it's coming out from the tree. It's branched like a nomadon, but it's got a very different texture. And it's also, Neckera is also branched, but you can see it has a very different texture from both of those because it's got a very scaly look to it, almost a reptilian look. And it's because the leaves are each of those round little scales you can see on the surface are actually individual leaves. So it has this overlapping set of overlapping scales that give it that texture. And so that's a picture. These are pictures of it at sort of like normal dampness, I guess. That's sort of like the ideal dampness. And then here's a picture of it very, very wet and very, very dry. You can see when it's very, very wet, it has sort of almost like a gelatinous appearance, which actually tends to be the case for a lot of leafy liverworts. And when it's dry, it has a much more papery appearance. But in both cases, you can see that series of overlapping scales. So you can sort of tell it from other things just by looking at that set of the pattern of scales. The next species is New York scalewort. So both are called scalewort, but they look very different. Now, New York scalewort, I guarantee you, you have seen this on a tree. It is very, very common especially in hardwood forests. It has this really cool fractal pattern in a lot of cases. If you get a colony that's sort of just starting to grow or hasn't grown very densely, it has this really cool kind of snowflake fractal pattern. And so when you look at it up close, you can, under magnification, you can see all the individual scaly. It also has a scaly appearance, again, because of each of these individual little lobes are the individual leaves. These ones are much, much smaller than on wall scalewort. These ones are, less than, about 1 millimeter in width. So very, very, very small. And what makes this one pretty distinct from other groups is it is also tends to be this very dark purple to blackish color. You can find it green if in certain growing conditions, and also other species in the same genus can be green as well. And so I think that's it for trees.
Yeah, so I'm just going to touch very briefly on a few of the places where you can see unusual bryophytes in the national capital, some of my favorites. And the first one here is called cavernous crystalwort. It's a liverwort. These are millimeters on the scale bar here, just so that you can orient yourself. And From a distance, it looks sort of like the silvery bryum that we also saw in the cracks of sidewalks. But if you zoom in, you can actually see these kind of rosette-shaped thalli of a little tiny thalloid liverwort. So, so beautiful. And if you go in even closer, you can see these pits in the surface of the thallus. So that's why the cavernous in the crystalwort's name. This picture on the left is from June, and then in August, it had grown quite a bit more so that all of the different liverworts were overlapping each other in the crack. And I went back in October to see how it was doing, and they had repaved the entire front of this arena. So that population is gone. It is officially a rare species in Ontario and Quebec, but I know of at least 4 places that it grows in Ottawa sidewalks. So I headed over to Carlingwood to take a picture in May and discovered that they've constructed something over that sidewalk as well. But there's a third place here where it's just getting started. I took this picture last week, right in the cracks of the sidewalk outside of our own Museum of Nature. So if you're hanging around out there waiting for your turn to go in, for example, there's another thing you can do to practice with your hand lens. Later in the season, it will have nice big, recognizable at least, thalli in the cracks of the sidewalk there. There is a rare species also that grows on the walls of the canal. And this is a species that likes normally in the Great Lakes to be washed by waves. So it's dry and then it's wet, it's dry and then it's wet. And so you can imagine that the walls of the canal are a perfect spot for it. The water's coming up and going down. And the former curator of bryophytes at the museum discovered that although this plant grows much further south, more commonly it's followed the canal all the way up to Ottawa and is present in pretty much every lock along the system. This is just the map from his paper on that discovery. It's in the canals, but it's also showing up on natural substrates along this route. So that's a bit of a development since this discovery was made in the 90s. And finally, this one is not rare, but it's an example of an ephemeral species. It means that it shows up in the spring and it disappears entirely. Unlike many other species that we've looked at today, you could go in the dead of winter, for the shingle moss, for example, you could go and look at it in February or March or October, and it would still be there on the tree trunk. But this one shows up in the spring or at certain times of year, and then it's gone, and you can't go back and check on it. You can just check to see if it comes back the next year. This example is called the pear-shaped goblet moss, and it was just in a lawn. Here's that little cluster of capsules. And you can zoom in here. Here it is, just in the context of the lawn and the surroundings where I found it. I wanted to mention it in particular because there is a project on iNaturalist where they're gathering observations of this plant and also welcoming samples for DNA analysis. So you can go online and learn about that. And back to Cassandra now to wrap it up.
Okay, so yes, now that we're hoping we've got you all super excited about bryophytes, I'm going to go looking as soon as you can. We just wanted to go over some resources to help you get started if you want to try your hand at starting to examine and differentiate and ID bryophytes. So as you can probably tell by most of the species we've talked about and groups we've talked about, magnification is key. You need at least a magnifying glass. Ideally, a hand lens is best. If you don't have sort of a typical hand lens, you can also get things like a jeweler's hand lens, and that's in the next slide. The left is a hand lens that I have as a backup. That's a jeweler's lens. And you can also get, on the left is actually, you can get attachments for your phone now that are basically for your little microscope that you can put on the camera portion of your phone, and it'll magnify. So in this case, it'll magnify the image 30 times. So that can be quite useful too, depending on what you're interested in doing. So those are some tools. And also, of course, field guides. So to get started, field guides are really, really key. They go over the most common species, and they provide a lot of photographs and and they focus more on characters and traits that you can see just with a hand lens at most. And so it doesn't require seeing things under a microscope most of the time, which is very, very handy when you're starting out. Another useful resource is people. When I started, I learned most of what I know about bryophytes from Jennifer. And so having someone that you can go to with questions, who has looked at a lot of things and can sort of get those has a quick eye for differentiating things, and especially sometimes the terminology can be kind of challenging. So being able to explain it in a way that's intuitive, and also to get you out seeing things that are really interesting and cool. So of course you can get to know your local bryophyte herbarium, because there will be experts there like Jennifer. So in this case, that would be the Canadian Museum of Nature and Jennifer. And the other thing you can do is get involved in groups that are enthusiastic about bryophytes. So on the Quebec side, there's a great example. The Société Québécoise de Pylaisia is very active and are amazing people, very friendly. Even during the pandemic, they've stayed active. They have virtual bryological soirees where they just meet on Zoom in their studies, and they take out moss that they found, and they go through the keys, and they explain the keys to each other, and they work together to try and figure out what they found. That's really, really cool. And the other thing is, if you're just starting out, before the pandemic, and hopefully when the pandemic is over as well, there were beginner workshops called the randonnée quotidienne. And so those are really, really great ways to go out in the field, collect things, and have people get you more comfortable looking at the right characters, and sort of showing you different species, and getting accustomed to that, and also able to look at it under a microscope in the lab. So you're able to see more in those kinds of settings than you would be able to at home. Online resources. I will mostly focus on iNaturalist, but I just want to mention a couple resources if you want to see photos of a given species. If you just want to look up a species by name and then see photos, there's bryophytes in Quebec, which is the Quebec Labrador database on bryophytes. And the Ohio Moss and Lichen Association has actually a really good website that shows photos of some of the most common species in Ohio, which also happen to be many of those species are also very common here, because mosses are very cosmopolitan. But for the most part, iNaturalist is really a fundamentally useful tool for getting to know, getting more comfortable with looking at bryophytes and trying to figure out what they are. The photo. So I'm assuming most of you go into detail about how it works, but just to say that it is very good, even with something small and fairly less studied, less attention given as bryophytes. The photo recognition app the photo recognition function is actually surprisingly good, and it's also there's also an active community of naturalists on iNaturalist that will identify observations of bryophytes. There's also several local projects that you can get involved in that can include bryophytes. So for example, if you're participating in Ontario Botanist Big Year 2021, looking at bryophytes is a great way to add plant species to that list because they are plants. So, you know, you can get a good jump up on other people if you can add some bryophyte species to that list. And iNaturalist has also been used actually by Jennifer in the past to track, is still being used to track rare species. And so those are just a couple of examples. And so we really like identifying things on iNaturalist, but sometimes it can be tricky to do. So sometimes we'll have examples where we have something that someone clearly saw something that they thought was really interesting and they took a photo, and that's awesome. Unfortunately, it's, you know, you'll get these occasions where it's so blurry, you really can't tell what's going on and you can't really tell what it is. So in this case, we have true mosses. It's identified as true mosses, and that's probably where it's going to stay. That's about as close as you can get with that level of detail. So we were thinking about that, and we thought that we would introduce sort of a beginner's guide to the ideal set of photos to take on iNaturalist to allow things to be identifiable. And so this is assuming without a microscope. Of course, if you have a microscope, hey, microscope photos, excellent. But without a microscope, these are the ideal situation. Ideal meaning, you know, if you don't have all of these, that's totally fine. We often do not have all of these. But it's just an idea of what to aim for. So the ideal would be to have several different photos. At least one of the habitat you found, found the species in, one of a close-up of the whole colony, either or two if you can, one from top down and one in profile, if possible, and then a close-up of the leaves and a close-up of the capsule, again, if possible. And so you could see in the previous slide a photo of the habitat, and there was a scale card, and now you can see a close-up of that same colony with that same scale card in the same place. It's useful to keep the scale, whatever you're using for scale, it is useful to use something for scale. And if you do, it's nice to keep it in the photo in the same spot. So yeah, you can see here there's the scale card in the habitat photo. So that little green patch is the species of interest, and then zoomed into the colony. And I say it's helpful to keep the scale object in as many photos as possible, but it isn't always possible. So I as a poor photographer, I am giving sort of the poor photographer's advice. So you can, in the previous example, you could see the scale card was actually getting, the phone wanted to focus on the scale card instead of the colony. And if that happens, it may be a better idea to take a picture of the scale card and then take the scale card away and get a better focused picture of the colony if you need to. And so then looking at a close-up of the leaves and the capsules. So this is a photo of both the close-up leaves and capsules on the left, on the sort of bottom left. This is as close as I could get. This photo was actually taken holding my hand lens up to the camera of my phone. I have used that on occasion, and it actually works quite well. So if you do have something that you can use to magnify, if you magnify it in front of the camera, as long as you're able, sometimes it's hard to keep it still. So that can be challenging, but that is a good way to get as close as possible. And then if you can get a capsule in profile, that's very, very helpful, like on the top right here. This is one I took with that phone attachment that I was talking about. And sometimes that actually helped me to keep from shaking. So I can get a little bit cleaner photos that way. But of course, sometimes you find something really interesting and you don't have your hand lens on you, you just have your phone. It's like, well, there's no way I'm going to get that close. So in a pinch, my advice, if you want to get a capsule really, really clear in profile, put your hand down just behind it. And then it's easier and a lot faster to get a focused photo with your phone than just trying to, because otherwise it'll just keep focusing on stuff in the background, I find. So I've learned to just go straight to the hand down, take a picture. And having said that as well, so in the next slide, there's if you ever find that you're taking a picture of a colony and all you can see is just scraggly lumps, and you can tell that there's more detail there, but you aren't getting it in the photo, sometimes it's helpful to put your hand down behind an individual shoot and then take a picture of that. So that's it for sort of photography tips. And now, shall we do the quiz?
Why not? Let's try it.
We don't have to do a quiz. If you want to stop, just stop. That's fine too. Or if you want to, talk about mosses that you've seen, or if you have any questions, we can do that as well. We have the practice slides here if anyone is wanting to do that, but it's not at all mandatory.
How many are there?
Well, I don't know, actually. I mean, the first series is just deciding whether or not something is moss or not. And then we could go on forever with individual species that we have talked about.
I know I told one of the participants that I would go over the answers to the moss versus lichen slides that I'd put up at the beginning.
Why don't we go back there then?
Sure, yeah. So in this slide, yeah, we have at one or two species of vascular plant. One of them looks kind of dead. We have at least two species of lichen, and I think we just have one species of moss, if I am getting that, if I'm seeing that correctly. So we have so Jennifer, maybe you can point out since you have the cursor there. So the moss is the shaggy, that would be big red stem, hey?
That's right.
Probably, yeah. So the moss is that yellow-green shagginess. There are two different species of lichen. One is the cladonia. Oh, there's two actually, they're both cladonias. They're both, there's the reindeer lichen there, the star-tipped reindeer lichen that Jennifer's highlighting now, the very bushy one. And then there's also this, the pixie cup, a type of pixie cup lichen, which has a very strange shape to it. And then there's the bog cranberry for vascular plants. And then it looks like starflower, maybe, that's not doing so good.
Yeah, it looks like the end of the season for the starflower.
Yeah, so those two are vascular flowering plants. So I hope that helps. Oh, down the hole at the edge of our tiny green leaves. And yes, I would be very curious. Actually, I didn't notice that when I first looked at that photo, but the couple times after, I kind of want to know what's down there, actually. So on the branch, again, the yellow-green, softer textured plant is the moss. So you can see for most of the branch is covered in this moss, and I think it's a hypnum, a very small hypnum. And then the mint green lobe organism is a lichen. Yeah, the lichen there. Okay. And then another question, are moss, so I could just start reading questions. There's just the one aside from I
have
other.
A few accumulated from people. But
Awesome.
Start with that one in the.
Okay. Are moss like Rixia simply overlooked because of how tiny they are, or do they need a specific habitat?
Oh, I think a little bit of both myself. I mean, they're also a little bit ephemeral for one thing. So if you're in the right spot at the wrong time, you won't see it. They're less likely to be recorded because of that. But they're also very small. They look like nothing if you aren't looking at the ground all the time like we are. They're very easy to miss. And they do have pretty specific requirements in nature, when they're not on sidewalk cracks, they're often along the margins of creeks or on the sand, like relatively stable sand at the side of water bodies, where they're consistently moist and they don't have a lot of competition. So it's a whole combination of factors. But I think it's, you know, pretty funny that they are in sidewalks, given how rare they're thought to be, or how rare they seem to be in nature.
All right. I was hoping, I was going to ask if you could give an example of a natural situation of that cavernous crystalwort, because that's totally bizarre to me. I guess it basically did right there. All right, so I have some other questions here. First, I have some that were emailed to me in advance. It's quite considerate. So John Foster was asking, he has the Brodo publications, which I believe those are for lichens. What are the best sources for bryophytes and phytics that occur in Ontario and the rest of Canada? So basically, can you give a recommendation for resources?
I'm guessing for probably bigger manuals then, instead rather than field guides, if it's because so sort of like the lichens of North American equivalent of for bryophytes.
Given the audience we have, maybe both would be good.
Okay, yeah. So we've mentioned a couple of the field guides that are really useful. So the mosses of Northeast, common mosses of Northeast and Appalachians is good. Yeah, actually, maybe Jennifer, go to that slide. So there's a couple, and I have common mosses of the Northeast and Appalachians. Also, for manuals, yeah, so these are some field guides that are really, really good. And to be honest, there isn't much else out there. There isn't a ton of selection for field guides, but these ones are fantastic. For manuals, the one that I use is, but it's in French, is Jean Faubert's Bryophytes, Flore des Bryophytes du Québec Labrador, because the Quebec species are very similar to the species you can find in Ottawa. And Jennifer, maybe you have other comments on manuals.
Yeah, well, the Quebec one is really fantastic because it's comprehensive. It has 900 and some taxa of both mosses and liverworts, and they're all illustrated, and they're, you know, almost all relevant to Ontario because they covered their entire, you know, north to south, east to west range. It's a fantastic resource, and I understand that it's in the process of being redone, like re-updated, to catch up with new discoveries and taxonomic changes and so on. So I'm really excited that one's still being worked on. But online there is the Flora of North America, which has all of the species in North America of mosses. They're still working on the liverworts. So it's handy in that it definitely has all the species that you might be looking at. And if you happen to travel, then it will have the flora no matter where you go in North America. On the downside, well, on the upside also, it's online as well as in hard copy, so it's easy to access. But only 1 or 2 taxa per genus are illustrated, and so you kind of need to use it in tandem with the internet or another book so that you can see what things look like when you come to an answer and the key. You need to switch resources to try and figure out what that looks like and double check your conclusion. There's another really nice one, not very new, but still very useful, called the Moss Flora of the Maritime Provinces. It's great when you're starting out because it has a key that starts from, you know, you have an unknown moss. It doesn't require you to know what the genus is off the top, similar to the Quebec one, but it's in English. And everything is illustrated, and it has a picture glossary and a nice set of definitions of all of the terminology. So I really like that one for starting out. And that one is out of print, but it's available on the Biodiversity Heritage Library, so you can access that one online as well.
Perfect.
In fact, sometimes it's useful to just, I might actually recommend just printing the illustrated glossary if you're interested in getting in looking at mosses more, because that illustrated glossary can be really, really useful.
All right. John's sort of follow-up question, if you will, is he says he has thousands of bryophyte and hepatic photos. What is the best place he can go if he needs help identifying them? And I'm guessing a naturalist, if you've already talked about that. Would that make sense for someone that has a large archive of photos of these things to upload there?
I think so. I guess it would depend on if there are coordinates and a date for the photos. If they correspond to like something that you can turn into an observation, then yeah, for sure.
I agree. I think that's a good place to start. I mean, you can use the resource. You know, you can access the machine identification at least. And so it might help with the initial sorting, but it sounds like a big fun project to work through all of those images. You'll probably need additional resources as well, but iNaturalist might be a nice place to start.
All right. So questions from meeting here. Maureen and Paul Carrier are asking, how deep or extensive are the root systems on mosses?
I love that question, partly because I took out my slides about that and now use them. But mosses actually don't have roots. That's the short answer. They're sometimes called non-vascular plants because they don't have xylem and phloem, or those kind of tubes that carry water and nutrients that we learn about in high school biology. This is a cross-section of a tree root. And there's some wood developing here. This is, you know, structure that not only holds the plant up, but also carries water and nutrients. And this is a cross-section through a moss stem. There's really nothing in there. It's a sponge, a sort of an undifferentiated sponge. So it doesn't carry water internally, really, except in the same way that a sponge would. And although there are kind of root-like structures at the base of the stem, they're only for anchoring. They're not for, you know, grabbing resources from the soil and carrying them up into the above ground parts of the plant. They also, besides anchoring the plant, they kind of increase the spongy area so that it can attract a little more moisture to the plant. There's just one more photo here that shows how those rhizoids in this case are going all the way up and down the stem. So there's a lot of felting there that sucks in water and holds it close to the plant so that it can remain active and grow for as long as possible before it dries out again and it has to wait for the next rainfall.
Okay. Are there advantages for mosses growing on trees rather than on the ground?
I think there are advantages and disadvantages to pretty much every substrate and habitat. On trees, they wouldn't be covered up with leaf litter, for example. They would be kept free of those kinds of things that might fall and shade them. And they would be maybe subject to different kinds of traffic than they would on the ground. But things that are on trees are also more exposed to air pollutants, and they would be on the like in the way of the through fall of rain, that, you know, that might be picking up pollutants that have deposited on the leaves. And so
Yeah.
there are there's an advantage and a disadvantage to pretty much any substrate or microhabitat.
I do.
Okay. Different type of question. Are mosses found on every continent, or do they only occur within certain latitudes?
Every continent. They're one of the few things that grows in Antarctica, and I think it's one of the few things that has more than one species in Antarctica.
Cool. Any idea when mosses first appeared on Earth? In terms of geological.
Ooh, Jennifer, do you remember? Do you have a year offhand?
I should know this off the top, but I don't.
They are
Yeah.
very, very old, evolutionarily. They're some of the first land plants.
The fact that, yeah, their sort of cell repair mechanism, the way that they can dry out completely and then revive, is sort of an early adaptation to life on land. So they're very old organisms.
An early adaptation, but I wish I had that. Okay, basic question from Ken. What's the difference between a spore and a seed?
Well, a seed has an embryo in it, and it's diploid, so it has the genetic information from both parents inside. It also has some food to start the seed off. And spores are haploid. They just are. They have half the genetic information in them. The plants of mosses themselves also are haploid, and they don't carry a lot of supplies with them. It's just you know, a single cell that is capable of growing into a new plant.
Okay. And then one more from Jonathan Mack. He's asking, he'd like to get familiar with moss microscopy. He has a microscope. He's wondering if it would be good practice to look at the eulota-like things he finds on bark.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the what type of things on bark?
I may not be.
Eulota.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, mosses are so beautiful. As soon as you see one, you want to see them all, so that you can see how they differ from each other, and all of the different details that exist, you know, as you zoom in closer and closer to see shapes and cells and things like that. Eulota is a great place to start. I know that some people, when they're learning, will choose one habitat just to limit the number of species they might be dealing with. So they might choose, okay, I'm going to only look at tree trunks, and I'll learn the, I don't know, 50 species that I might run into on tree trunks first of all, and Eulota is a good one to start with. And you could go on to just focus on that family that Cassie was talking about, the Orthotracaceae, and you'll know that you're always going to start with that key when you're trying to figure them out. And there's still plenty of species to find if you're restricting yourself to that group.
Thanks.
Good luck.
All right, and two more, if it's okay, that have questions have prompted more questions, as they do. So this spore question is prompted from Roger Magoon here. Does that mean there is no sexual reproduction in mosses if they produced by spores?
Well, no, it doesn't mean that. They're just I have slides for this too that I took.
The life cycle slides.
But like in flowering plants, the sperm is transferred in pollen, right? And so the fertilization happens within the diploid plant, and it immediately becomes diploid again, and it's a diploid seed that's dispersed. In mosses, they are haploid and they produce those male plants that I showed you with the flower-like buds. The sperm from there, they swim through the rainwater or the flood water or the river water or whatever. They swim to fertilize the egg, which might be in a different plant. It might be in a different bud of the same plant. And then you get this diploid stalk and capsule. And inside the capsule, there's these haploid spores. So it's just the sexual reproduction happens in a different way in mosses and sort of a different, different structures and different times and so on, but it still happens for sure. And I think they're a lot better at vegetative reproduction as well. So they rely on both strategies.
I'm a little bit stunned at the mobility there. Wow, that's cool. All right, and then last question, or I'll make this the last question. So if anyone asks other questions, they're not going to get asked. When one sees a little cushion of moss, as in a chunk blown off of a roof, there's a lower layer that looks dead and solid, and only a top layer of the cake that is green and has visible leaves. Is that just a buildup of persistent dead material, kind of like a coral reef, or is it actually still alive all the way to the bottom of the cushion if you drill down in it, or if you soaked it enough that it got wet all the way to the bottom?
Well, there's lots in there to talk about. The lower layer is probably a combination of rhizoids and plant material and probably other particles that have fallen and gotten caught in between the mosses and formed a kind of a solid mat. And with some species, they grow up and they'll accumulate more and more plant matter below that is no longer in contact with the sun. So it doesn't grow nice and green and fluffy the same way as the stuff on top. But an extreme example of that would be sphagnum or peat mosses, which grow in bogs. And they grow, indefinitely up. And over thousands of years, you get meters and meters of peat built up. It's sort of the same plant on the top and on the bottom, very far apart from each other, but the peat at the bottom isn't decaying because of the conditions in the bog. So that's sort of the extreme of what you're seeing on the roof. I also should mention that, moss cushions that have been covered up or frozen in Arctic ice for hundreds or thousands of years can come out and just start growing again. It's astounding. And there's information about this on the web. The study is from the University of Alberta. So at the bottom of the cake that came off the roof, there might be cells in there that are still capable of regenerating if they came out into the environment where it would be appropriate. Not that they've been preserved in ice the same way that the moss in the glacier would have, but there may be cells down there that don't look happy that are still capable of regenerating when they get the right light and moisture conditions.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you both very, very much for giving us this very interesting and very detailed presentation. If you read the chat comments right now, you'll see a few more people saying thank yous, and I'm sure in a minute people will start waving or clapping or something with their Zoom windows. There we go. So again, appreciate you taking the time this evening to give us this introduction to mosses and lead us all to go get fascinated by and obsessed with another part of nature. So very good. All right, and for everyone still on the call, thank you very much for coming. Hope you enjoy it, and we'll see everyone again at the June monthly meeting, which will be once again here on Zoom. So have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Good
Susan.
night. Great presentation.